I'm going to get a little wordy in this lecture this week, and I'm actually going to split this up into two parts just for your own viewing convenience, I suppose. One of the things that I've noticed in the readings that we have for this particular course is that we have readings from different texts that touch on some of the issues regarding specific racial and ethnic groups in America and the kinds of difficulties that they may face. But there's really not a spot where all of them are kind of pulled together in a summary, more or less. And so the purpose of these two lectures really is to kind of isolate 4 or 5 different racial and ethnic groups in America and touch on some of the big issues that those communities face. The most recent census definition regarding racial categories separates Americans into 5 separate categories, that is, white American, black or African American, Native American and Alaska Native, Asian American, and of Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and then also gives a classification for people of more than one race. The Census Bureau has classified respondents as Hispanic or Latino or not Hispanic or Latino, identifying Hispanic and Latino as an ethnicity, not a race. And that group does comprise the largest minority group in the nation. So notice here that somebody of Latin origins is going to identify with one of the 5 primary races or one of the individuals with 2 or more races in the census itself. I have read that the Census Bureau gave some consideration to adding a group for Middle Eastern and North African to the census this year, but the decision has been made apparently to leave the 5 categories as they are, and so the Middle Eastern and North African individuals will also be identifying in one of these 5 racial groups. So as far as racial minority groups in the United States are concerned, African Americans constitute the largest racial minority group, but as mentioned earlier, Latinos represent the largest ethnic minority in the United States at nearly 18% of the general population. Hispanic or Latino is defined by the Census Bureau as a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. And again, states that Hispanics or Latinos can be of any race, any ancestry, any ethnicity. But the dominant group in the United States is, not surprisingly, those of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or WASP, Northern European descent. Some facts involving racial and ethnic minority groups in the United States are going to follow for the remainder of this lecture. The first group we're going to look at is African Americans, who earn about 58% of white income on average, have a higher poverty rate and greater unemployment, are less likely to own their own homes. And while there has been an increase in that population as far as incomes over $50,000 a year is concerned, there has also been an increase in African American homes earning less than $5,000 a year as well. The typical black household is now poorer than 90% of white households, and 1/3 of African Americans live below the poverty line. Among some of the leaders of the African American community in the last 50 or 60 years, Malcolm X was a charismatic leader who counseled against assimilation. He wished to deconstruct what he believed was a slavery mindset among blacks and urged them to be less concerned about pleasing whites and the white culture and to take greater pride in themselves. This, in fact, formed much of the basis for the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 1970s, this kind of thinking. The most overt form of prejudice from 50 or 60 years ago that was evident has evolved into a more subtle form and has become, or had at least become, somewhat deniable for the white majority. In 2008, when Barack Obama campaigned for the presidency, he indicated that he believed we were a post-racial society. Of course, it didn't take long for us to recognize this was not the case, and many individuals didn't really think that was the case to begin with. Anti-black racism and prejudice has continued to persist in American society. And it's become more obvious as of late with prominent issues around the shootings of young black men by police and law enforcement individuals, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the Take a Knee protests that all have drawn attention in society. American society continues to see African Americans as unworthy of full equality, even as individuals within our society recognize the bigotry involved in such a belief. African Americans face many problems due to institutional racism, such as the inordinate percentage of African American men in prisons. And this is blamed on the black community and insulates the institutions themselves against racism charges. Angela Davis, who was a notable activist in the Black Power movement in the 1960s and 1970s, has written about race and criminalization and asserts that race is disguised in encoded language and results in what she calls camouflage racism. She points to the high statistics of blacks in the prison system, that it is said to be evidence of black criminality rather than it being recognized as an institutional issue. She sees that the fear of crime has replaced the fear of communism following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that racism has resulted in pervasive, systematic, and implicit ways. The highest number of drug users are white, and yet prisons are filled with African American men and women, mostly because of drug-related crimes. And the penalties for drug use is greater for those drugs that tend to be used by lower-income individuals. Here, the race-neutral war on drugs of the 80s plays out in ways that suggest racism is inherent in it. Reparations is discussed from time to time with some frequency, and there are some arguments in favor and some in opposition to it. Some ideas include the fact that European and American economic success was directly attributable to the black persons held in slavery. The burden of structural racism has excluded blacks from the mainstream of society, with that group as a rule having less wealth, being denied home loans more often, being among those last hired and among those first fired, being noted to have shorter life expectancies and greater incarceration rates, and so on. While African Americans account for about 15% of drug use, they account for 35% of all drug arrests, 55% of all drug convictions, and 75% of all prison admissions for drug offenses. In fact, studies have shown consistently that if you're an African American, you're more likely to be engaged in the criminal system from first being stopped by the policeman up through and including executed for crimes than if you're a white person. There are some arguments that oppose reparations, including the belief that what is some people think of as a revolution in civil rights that resulted in great improvement for blacks in America, and that nothing more is needed. That the reparation for what happened to ancestors that are barely known to modern-day blacks would be more like blood money, more so than reparations. And that really, instead of reparations, our society needs to focus upon helping blacks help themselves through better educational opportunities and different approaches to education for black individuals. There are many other areas that could be discussed in regards to African Americans in the United States, and this just touches on a very few issues related to that particular group. The Latino population, or Latinx population, which includes both Latinos and Latinas, is the largest ethnic group in the United States. 70% of those individuals are concentrated in California, Texas, New York, and Florida. Almost half cannot speak English. There's been a recent increase in resentment towards Latinos due to immigration issues, competition for jobs, and the supposed drain on the taxpayer, and this has been quite the center of focus in the news for the last 2 or 3 years in particular. Latinos are subject to outright racism in some areas. An example is a vote in Miami some years ago to make English the official language of the city, and the targeting of Mexicans more recently in the shooting in the Walmart in El Paso, Texas. There's an image of the Latinx as primarily connected to a farm-oriented lifestyle, but in fact about 85% of them in the United States live in urban areas. This population is very heterogeneous and has many different national origins, racial characteristics, and generational statuses in the U.S. Latino or Latinx, as opposed to Hispanic, is coined by the people who belong to that group and has a geographical reference for that group to Latin America. Racial identity of the Latinx population represents a wide variety of physical characteristics and racial makeup, and a lot of difference in cultural beliefs as well. Poverty levels tend to be high among most Latinx groups in the United States, with lower educational levels and high unemployment rates. But these rates vary from group to group, and a significant number of Latinos hold semi-skilled or low-skill positions in the workforce in America. Immigration histories vary from group to group. Mexican Americans were subject to what they have said to be the border coming to them rather than their crossing the border through the results of the Mexican-American War in the mid-1840s. Today, many come to this country to escape the poverty, crime, and political unrest in their own country. Mexicans represent about 63%, slightly less than two-thirds of the Latin population in the United States. There's a lot of negative attention given to undocumented immigrants that has resulted in hostile, discriminatory, and sometimes violent behavior towards Latinos. Puerto Ricans have come to the United States for political and economic opportunity, particularly after World War II, and is often the case in American history, have been welcomed or less welcomed depending upon the employment needs of the mainland at the time. Trade policies in the 1940s industrialized the Puerto Rican economy and created a pool of unemployed laborers there that could not be absorbed on the island, and so they were pushed to seek employment in the United States. In 1957, another labor shortage in the Northeast led to the federal government recruiting laborers from Puerto Rico to help in the hotel, garment, and domestic industries, particularly in the urban areas of the Northeast. But as the demand for industrial jobs declined over the last few decades, the standard of living for Puerto Ricans has deteriorated. Cuban immigration has occurred in different waves, some before the Castro era and others since. They reflected a mix of social and educational classes. The first post-Castro wave tended to be more heavily involved with persons with higher degrees of education as communism began to take hold on the land. And actually, this was also true of the pre-Castro migrants as well from Cuba. But then after Castro had been in control of the island for some time, individuals from lower economic classes came to the United States during such waves of immigration as the Mario boat lift in the 1980s. As you know, Central and South Americans have immigrated particularly from El Salvador and Nicaragua. Donald Trump talked about the caravan of immigrants threatening the borders of the United States, in fact, in 2018 and 2019. These people tend to be fleeing political violence, war, and crime and poverty in their homelands and apply for refugee status but often are denied refugee status and denied some support services as a result. While most undocumented immigrants are denied any sort of federal benefit during their stay in the United States, refugees are provided some limited, more emergency-based services by the government during their stay here. Of course, Central and South Americans have been the focus of much attention during the Trump administration. Efforts by the administration have been made to stem the tide of immigration through such policies as family separation at the border, which has since been stopped, and also denial of aid to the countries from which the immigrants are arriving. Of course, denying aid to the countries from which these individuals are arriving only increases the problems that is causing their migration to begin with. Dominican immigration increased since the late 1980s because of the terrible economic conditions on that island. They have tended to be of lower socioeconomic status upon arrival in America. Among this larger population, cultural interactions, shared traditions and values, and the Latin culture itself as a whole serve as protective factors for this group. Latinx who adhere to the cultural traditions have been found to have better health. But the process of acculturation to the larger United States society by the Latin immigrant results in the breakdown of traditional cultural and family norms and sometimes causes some chaos within the families themselves between the generations. Traditional beliefs such as the values of male authority and supremacy, gender role expectations, and standards of conduct for women are examples of areas where traditional values come into conflict with the trends of thinking in the United States. This creates a good deal of tension between the generations, particularly as the younger members of the immigrant family integrate into the larger American culture. This concludes the first part of this two-part lecture this week, and tune in for the second section as we discuss other minority groups in the United States.